We have a hashtag for this. If anybody's tweeting, please use the Twitter. But anyway, there it is. Vanessa Dennen is an associate professor of instructional systems and learning technologies at Florida State University and the co-editor-in-chief of the Internet and Higher Education. She has a PhD from Indiana University and an MS from Syracuse University. Vanessa has authored more than 50 journal articles and book chapters. At Florida State University, Vanessa teaches courses on instructional design and research methods for new and emerging technologies and has served as an ISLT program coordinator since 2008. She has received 6 teaching and mentoring awards at FSU since 2013, and in 2014, with the assistance of a group of graduate students at Florida State University, she designed and taught the social media for active learning MOOC, a professional development offering for educators and instructional designers.
Wonderful. I was really pleased to be involved with the planning of the symposium and to be asked to moderate this panel about publishing for engagement and impact, because I think it's such an important topic. As I became an associate editor and then an editor for a journal over the last few years, I learned so much. My previous perspective on publishing was, well, I think a very typical one when you're first looking for a job and then you're trying to get promoted and tenured. It was just, how do I get those lines on my Vita? And how do I make sure they're the right lines that I have on my Vita? But as soon as I moved over to the editorial side, I started to realize that I was actually taking a role in something that had a much bigger picture than just me. And it was taking on some responsibility for my field and the larger conversation of research that was taking place in my field. And so as we discuss various topics on our panel this morning, I think we're going to be touching on some of those issues and how editors and publishers are playing a role and have this picture from above about the way that our scholarly work comes together to really change what happens in research and change what happens in many of our fields in practice as well. So this morning I will start by introducing each of our panelists and give them a moment to talk briefly about their journal, because they all have, or their publishing company, I should say, because they're all coming from slightly different places and perspectives here, and it's really nice that we have that diversity this morning. Then we have 4 topics that I'm going to invite the panelists to speak about for a bit, and then finally we will open things up to questions at the end of the session this morning. So I'm going to start by introducing Carolyn Herrington, who's a professor here in Ed Leadership and Policy Studies, and she is the editor of Educational Researcher. Carolyn, would you like to tell us a few things about your journal?
Yes, Educational Researcher is a unusual journal in that it is the signature journal, if you wish, even though that's not exactly the right word, for the American Educational Research Association. About 10 or 15 years ago, the journal, of course, only came out in print, and it comes out 9 times a year. Since the beginning of the journal, I think about 60 years ago, it included a lot of information about the association. The American Educational Research Association is the largest educational research association in the world, and much of the business of the association was reported in the journal. About 10 years ago, there was a decision made to make the journal more focused just on research and not to be so much a way to distribute information about the association. That was no longer necessary since that could be done online. But it was a wonderful opportunity to have the journal focus itself exclusively on research, and that's where we are now. It is unusual in the sense that every member of AERA, it has about 26,000 members, receives a print copy free as a part of their membership. And everything is available free online, so there's no, anyone in the world who has access to the internet can access all the journals in the back issues as well, so it's a free publication, if you will. And it's a little unusual in that all of education, I think it's the broadest of education research journals, in that anything having to do with education is theoretically suitable for publication in this journal.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Sara Scott Shields, who's an assistant professor of art education and the editor of Journal of Art for Life. Can you tell us about your journal?
Sure. We're a lot smaller. So we're housed actually here at FSU in the College of Art Education. It's a journal that's focused on theory, research, and then arts-based inquiry all around the art's impact on our lives. So we feature articles by art therapists, arts administrators, art educators, interior design. We've had some interest from those folks, museum education. So it's really, we're really interested in how art can enhance our existence as people. And we're an open access, only online journal, so we've gotten rid of the print version of the journal in the last couple years. So I inherited the journal from a retiring professor, and it's been a trial by fire. So I'm learning very quickly what it means to edit a journal. So.
Thank you. Okay, next up we have James Olcese, who has multiple roles here. Associate Professor in Biomedical Sciences, but Associate Editor of Frontiers in Molecular Neuroscience, and Specialty Chief Editor, you may have to explain to us what all of this means, of Frontiers in Endocrinology, Systems and Translational Endocrinology. Wow, that is a mouthful.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Frontiers was established in 2008 as a free online open access journal. It now has 54 journals associated with it. It encompasses 57,000 editors, so I'm only one of 57,000 editors. It's a community-run journal. It's a very novel approach to science publication. The journals encompass everything from neuroscience and endocrinology, areas I'm involved with, right through to library science and information science. So it's a very broad journal, and what's remarkable about it is that the process through which manuscripts are accepted is completely driven by researchers. There's no committee, there's no society that stands behind it deciding who gets published and not. And in the process of evaluating manuscripts, there is a in real time open review and discussion with the authors. So when they submit, they don't just get blank feedback from an anonymous person. There's actually dialogue ongoing continuously to try and refine the paper to the point where it's acceptable for publication. So this is a very exciting new way of approaching publication. It's really catching on. The impact factors, for what it's worth, are still developing, since it is a new journal and a new style, but it's in the 3 to 4 range at this point, and I think it's going to continue to grow. My role, as you indicated, is dual. Without getting too much into the publication process, since I think that's one of the topics we'll talk later about, there are several tiers of editors. As I mentioned, there are thousands of editors. The ones who do the heavy lifting are the review editors, and they are the ones who actually review the papers. They can call for help and get other researchers involved, but they are basically asked to be the workhorses and do the reviewing of the papers when called upon. Now, they're called upon by the associate editors, such as myself. So as an associate editor, I select, or invite, I should say, review editors. They don't have to accept, many don't, but those who do are expressing a willingness to review papers. And as I said, this is a very interactive sort of process. The specialty chief editor is a notch above the associate editor. That person's responsibility is to attend to the development of the journal, the scope of the journal. There are a lot of intricacies that I guess I don't have time right now to get into, we might later, but it's basically to manage a particular area within a larger context of the journal's topics. And then finally, there are the field editors, the chief editors, if you will, who run the different journals of those 54 I mentioned. So with that, I'll stop and answer questions.
That's frighteningly large. And last but not least, we have Elisabeth Leonard, who is the Senior Library Sales Manager at Sage Publications, and she's going to give us some of the publisher's perspective this morning. Can you tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure, I'm the Executive Market Research Manager.
Oh,
at
I'm sorry.
Sage.
We got that wrong.
That's no worries. And we had a last minute switch. So I am still Elisabeth Leonard. But
Right,
the
but
title of the
oh,
program.
I grabbed that off of some version of the program.
I'm all like gasping. Like, what happened? Hi. Sage was established in 1965 by Sara Miller McHugh, one of the first females to really make it big in publishing, and we're quite proud of that. We are an independent publisher, and it is something that will continue upon her passing, and it's something that sets us apart, I think, for a lot of for-profit publishers. In case anyone has ever wondered why Sage is blue and not green in our logo, it's because it's Sarah's favorite color. Sage does not stand for the herb. It is SA for Sara and GE for George, her husband. And we started as a social sciences publisher. It's our core. We've grown to 800 journal titles across the social sciences, humanities, science, technology, engineering, and a little bit of that.
Great, thank you. I never knew that about the title of Sage.
And you should.
It's good to know. A little bit of trivia to keep passing along to people. Okay, so, well, we already started to hear a little bit about the publication process. That's great because that leads us right into our first topic, which is the publication process. And we wanted to touch on this topic today because we know that many people coming from the perspective of being authors, you complete your manuscript, you upload it through the electronic system, or perhaps email it in, whatever happens to be the way of submitting it for the particular journal, and then you sit and wait. What happens behind the scenes while you sit and wait? And if it gets accepted, then what happens next? What's going on behind the scenes in the publication process? What are the editors and publishers doing? That's something that we would like to learn a little bit about right now. Some of the stuff that the authors may not know about.
There's so much, isn't there? Can I start with just like since we've begun a little bit about the sort of the structure behind the scenes. One of the things that we start with when we've got a new journal especially is making sure that we've selected the right editors, and that's no insignificant thing, finding the right editor for a journal. And so we start by looking to see, can we find the right person who doesn't just understand the topical area, but also someone who understands publishing ethics and has integrity behind that. And once the editor is then in place, there's training that goes on, so we make sure that they're aware of the COPE guidelines for publishing ethics. And then the publishing editor, because that's the person inside the publishing house, works with the journal editor to make sure that they know what the process is like within the publishing company. And then I'll leave it to y'all to say what happens when all of a sudden something pops up on your screen.
I'll just do a very brief walkthrough. The educational researcher has the editor turns over every 3 years, even though I unusually have ended up will be doing it for 5 years. But that's unusual. And then the editorial team right now, there's one editor, me, and I have 6 associate editors. That configuration changes with every 3 years, a different configuration. For example, last configuration was 2 co-editors and 5 associate editors. So it changes all the time. But when a journal pops up, when a submission pops up, which they do 24 hours a day, ER, which I thought was a large number, and I realize it's tiny. We receive only 400 a year, of which we publish about, end up publishing about 8%. When an article shows up, the timing is, we try to have the decision to the author by 60 days. We are not as successful as that as we'd like, but we absolutely are determined to have decision by 90 days. Anyway, the first decision is whether or not it should be a desk reject. And we have two categories of desk rejects. One is out of scope. For example, if it was about pediatric neurology, that would be out of scope for educational research. We're about institutional, educational institutions and the learning that takes place, and cognition. So that would be an out of scope. You'd be surprised how many I get. I think our title is particularly broad, educational researcher, so we get a lot of things out of scope. Then we get low quality, and that an article that simply does not seem to have, where the data doesn't seem appropriate for the questions they're asking, or the conclusions do not seem to be drawn from the data itself. There's a lot of poorly written. That would be, in other words, before we send it out to an editor to review, to one of the associate editors to select reviewers, then we want to make sure that the article has a chance of being positively accepted. Of course, it's a judgment call. If we feel it's a little ambiguous, we try to err on the side of sending it out to reviewers and not desk rejecting. But obviously, there's some subjectivity in that. Once it is decided to send to an associate, I as editor have 6 associate editors to choose from, and I try to match it up with their areas of expertise. Again, our journal is very broad, and often we may not often, but I'd say less than half the time we're having to send it out to an associate. I'm sending out to an associate editor who may not have expertise in that area. And then that associate editor will seek 3 people to ask to do a blind review of the article. We give the reviewers 3 weeks to do that. I'd say 50% of the requests to review are positive, and then other people will say, well, no, I decline to review, give no reason. I decline to review because I don't feel I'm qualified to review an article in this subject matter, or I have a conflict of interest. I've already heard this paper given at a conference, and I don't feel it's appropriate for me to review it. And then 3 weeks later, none of the reviews are in. The emails go out saying please, and the emails go out saying, we really, really need this. Anyway, that's the kind of the beginning of the mechanics of it.
So again, we're a much, much smaller journal. So we're right now, the transition to online and a new editor, we're doing right now just special call issues. So when we put out the special call, there's a deadline for the, so say November 15th. Basically everything comes in on the 14th and the 15th. So then we do, I send it out to the editorial board to do just to see if it's relevant to the journal and if we should send it out to reviewers. So once those decisions are made, we send it out to 3 reviewers, and we almost always get 2. And we really try to do the 60-day rule of thumb to get feedback back to the authors, but sometimes reviewers take quite a bit longer. So we hit 90 days is the absolute kind of, and if reviewers don't respond, which happens because we are a much smaller journal, then we cancel the request, send another one out, and so that can delay the process. And then, it goes through all the copy editing. So it's very similar, just on a much smaller scale. Much smaller scale.
A lot of it's
Yeah.
Well, as far as the frontiers, let me try and simplify it a little bit by focusing down to just one of the journals and not 54 of them. The journal called Frontiers in Endocrinology has 13 specialty sections. Endocrinology is a big area. So everything from pediatric endocrinology to molecular endocrinology to systems endocrinology and so forth. Within those specialty journals, the same structure is present, namely the chief editor, so-called the field chief editor, and then the specialty chief editor, of which I am one of 3 for systems and translational endocrinology. And then, as I mentioned, the associate editors who we, as specialty chief editors, have invited based upon their academic and research credentials. And then finally, they, together with us, identify the review editors, of which there are thousands. So when a manuscript is submitted, which of course is online at any time of day, it goes to the person to whom the author has identified. They can choose who they want to submit it to. So it doesn't automatically go to one person who then decides where to send it. The authors can say, I want to send it to this Olcese guy, and then I can pass it on to the associate editor who will then start the process. The associate editor, as I mentioned, is required then to find at least 2 review editors to begin the review process. As I mentioned, this is all done online, it's all done interactively. So as soon as the review editor accepts the invitation to review that paper, an email is sent out, bing, your paper is in review. And that starts the process. Within a few days, there will be comments put online to the authors from that review editor. The review editors at that point are anonymous, so they can be completely candid. Otherwise, you tell you who you are and you start getting nasty emails from the author's post office or something. Yeah. So it's done anonymously, at least at that stage. Once the process gets rolling, as I said, the back and forth discussion ensues. These are things like the figure 3 isn't clear, you need to put this kind of image in, or discussion needs to be expanded to include this point or that, etc. And that goes back and forth until unanimity is reached. Acceptance or rejection has to be unanimous. That can take some time, obviously. Some people are stubborn, they don't want to accept the recommendations of the review editor, so you've got to kind of talk with them and say, look, this is really in your best interest, you need to do this, and so it can drag on. Typically it doesn't. On average, the papers are accepted within 60 days, on average. And once they are, they then become available to the public, as in preparation. Then the community can start chiming in, can start making comments. So it's a really interesting notion that the community can start commenting about potentially conflict of interest or things of this sort, or that the state has already been published somewhere, things that might help to avoid an embarrassing situation. It doesn't happen too often, fortunately, in terms of a negative response. Once those papers are published, they can also become eligible for selection to a higher tier of publication, which is to say the Frontiers in Endocrinology has its select journal, select articles, sort of the outstanding article feature, and they can be selected for that, which provides the authors even more PR for their work. There's also a great effort to support the publishing authors by making press releases, making promotions of the data on social media. So it's a very interactive, engaging process, and it takes a lot of time and, of course, some money. So there are fees. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead again.
You're
Open
fine.
Access, of course, always has fees. There are different fees for different types of articles. There are also waivers, obviously, for people who don't have money. We never reject a paper because they can't pay the fee. But obviously there is an associated fee, which to the open access community is equivalent to what we had in the Middle Ages when I was a grad student, paying page charges for publication. So it's not that much different in that regard. But again, it can be negotiated, and we do have waivers. So I'm probably jumping all over the map here with my discussion, but
It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to take us back to actually something that Elisabeth mentioned. I noted that she kept talking about ethics and the importance of ethics. And I know something that I have as one of my tools as a journal editor. It's somewhat related to ethics. I have a plagiarism check tool, and I don't tend to catch people blatantly plagiarizing other people, but I have caught a bunch of self plagiarism, passing off 2/3 of your article that was published somewhere else a year ago. I was wondering if you, the editors, wanted to comment a bit, and perhaps also Elisabeth, on what you see and are managing in terms of ethics and how you deal with those things. It's definitely different in the digital age, too, I think, for noting these things.
Go ahead.
We run our papers through like a safe assign. It's very similar to what Blackboard has that you can run student work through. So just run it through and see, it'll highlight and tell you what percentage is suspicious, and then look and identify if it's actually plagiarism or it just happens to be it's highlighted because it matches something on a website, that the wording is similar. So we just carefully look through, and that happens before they ever go out for peer review. So that's like the first thing. I guess I didn't even cover that. That's the very first thing we do is the plagiarism check. Yeah.
And it's the same with us,
Yeah.
except we have a Sage platform, and so even before it comes to me as the editor, it has already been through
Through Authenticate.
Right. And the different levels. Some it's automatically sent back to the author. I never even see it.
Yeah.
But then also this kind of more of a judgment call that seems highly related to an article that was published last year. It seems to be the same author. And often what actually I end up dealing with more is the article that was submitted to us a year ago and we rejected at that time. Then it comes back to us a year later with a mildly different title, something like that. Again, that's a judgment call. We do have a standard policy that if an article has been rejected, it cannot be resubmitted until a year later. But we'd like to see the resubmission have been responsive to the reasons you rejected it. So it's a little bit of a judgment call.
With Frontiers, it's similar. There are forms when the authors submit that they have to fill out stating this has not been published elsewhere, there's no conflict of interest, and so forth. We do find that they were not telling the truth, of course, then papers rejected.
Okay, I'm going to move us along to the next topic, and in a way that gives us a segue, because it's in the digital world, it's so easy to copy things, but it's also so easy to find out that people have copied things, or we have these submission systems that tell you, oh, somebody submitted something a year ago, and oh, look, it's almost the same thing. But what other ways has the shift toward using online tools and online publishing, even if you still have a paper version of your journal, or if you're entirely online, in what ways has it affected your journal or your journals for Elisabeth?
Elizabeth supposed to?
Anybody can start in.
I guess the first thing I'll say, just on behalf of publishing writ large, is this shift from print to digital is significant when you think about information across the world, not just in terms of a single journal. So to break it down into something that's easier to understand, a single journal at Sage pre-digital age might have had a few hundred institutional subscribers to it. In a digital world, that could be several thousand institutional subscribers to it. You add in the ability for something then to also be open access, and you're not just talking about the institutions anymore, but you're talking about the individuals and how many individual readers there can be for a single article, not even a single journal, because the sort of disaggregation of information at that point is very real, where people know an article and may never know the journal, and certainly then at that level never know the publisher. And so it starts, I think, for a publisher, the important thing there is we are quite passionate about the fact that the reason that we are publishing is to advance scholarship. And so digital brings that together in a way that never, ever was possible in print.
I would say that the shift to digital is really exciting. This is probably the most exciting thing the thing I was looking forward to most about talking about. In the arts, there's journals, and we're JAFL, so the Journal of Art for Life, is working to get there. But the resources, we need a lot more resources than we have right now. But there are journals that are doing video entries, journals that are doing interactive articles that you create experiences for the viewer, for the reader, that we're shifting in my field of the fine arts and art education and arts administration. We're seeing a shift from readership to viewership experiences versus reading page by page. I talk a lot with the folks here at the library about getting away from PDFs and into something else. So moving beyond the 8.5 by 11, how can we think outside of those margins? I think that, for me, is what's really exciting about the shift to online platforms, is that we can offer experiences for readers instead of, and in the arts, that's a huge opportunity for us to not just include a video, but also you hear audio and move you through. So there's some cool journals, like the Journal for Artistic Research is a very cool, you kind of download this program onto your computer, and you can create levels of experience so that you can enter and kind of curate, like an exhibition, curate an experience for the viewer. And the Journal of Video Ethnography is doing some wonderful stuff with video submissions. They only take video submissions, so they don't take written submissions. So I think there's some journals out there that if I were to have idols, those would be some of my idols, But again, the problem is for us, we're not a fee-based journal. So we're open access, and the library here is graciously really helpful for us, but finding the resources to branch out. With just me and my very studious graduate student that is has an assistantship to help, so it's a very small group of people. So, and I'm not tenured yet, so I still have to write for folks like you, so that I can get to a point that I can maybe focus more energy on transitioning into really exciting online platforms. I think are there.
I think for educational research, for a journal that's been around for a long time and that is still associated with the association and it continues to have strong links. For example, the presidential addresses at the annual conference are pretty much automatically assumed to be published in educational research. There are 5 or 6 distinguished lectures over the course of the year. And now those are submitted as articles to ER, and we do have a review process. It may not be as extensive, it may be expedited, but I'm just giving this an example of kind of a attempt to both remain a journal associated with the association, but also to be intellectually stand on its own intellectual credentials in terms of the quality of the publications. But I think, again, unlike many other education research journals, who are, for the most part, quarterly journals, we come out 9 times a year. What I see as the huge impact of the digital age is that we still, if you will, we still create issues. And the issue itself has some sort of a life. Again, ours comes out in print. People receive it automatically if they're a member of AERA. But I see that, I was about to say, I see it falling apart. It's not falling apart, but there are new opportunities to think about that. For example, there's a very hot topic in educational research right now, which is the use of value-added methodologies to try to estimate the impact of a teacher on student learning. And we've probably published 5, 6, 7 of those articles over the last 2 or 3 years. There's an opportunity. Would we want to package them? If not, physically package them, at least make access to them a little more easily for someone. Again, all stuff is free, available online. Anyway, I think that for kind of an old standard journal, that's the most immediate opportunity that the digital world allows us to rethink the idea of an issue. And then, of course, the second thing, which we've been referred to, is the opportunity. We have short articles. Our articles only 5,000 words. They're quite short, and most of the work is empirical. So the authors can back up the data online, and so we don't have to have much of the data actually in the article itself, and that's a huge advantage, and allows us to would have been probably some research that we could not have published simply because it could not have been described in 5,000 words. So that's huge too. Now I do feel that we're probably not taking advantage of that as much in terms of actually using it, and we're also not thinking intentionally enough about how can that be used well. How can we differentiate, encouraging the reader to go to these websites, and different readers with different interests could be encouraged and directed in different ways, and we have not begun that discussion yet.
Well, Frontiers hasn't made a transition because it's always been digital, so all I can speak for is how it's going. Since its inception, there have been 40,000 articles published. If you did that in standard publishing, you'd have a lot of journals, a lot of paper. So I think that in itself speaks to one of its advantages. For me, I've noticed that a very strong benefit of digital publishing is that certainly in the Frontiers format, if an article comes to us, the author assuming it fits best in our specialty, and we decide it really doesn't, we can send it right over to the next specialty, which we think is more suited. So they have a better opportunity to be represented in the right category, so to speak, to get the right audience. So we're really helping authors to place their work in the most visible spot, which I think is a very strong benefit to them. Obviously, the journal publishes continuously. It's not a monthly type of thing. It's always every day new papers appear. So that, I think, makes it very useful. There have been 4 million article views per month of the Frontiers journals. So that says a lot about its global reach. Over 190 countries apparently have researchers who view the Frontier journals, and it's growing all the time. So I mean, there are just so many advantages to it. The statistics that we got at our latest teleconference was that open access is about to overtake classical publishing in terms of numbers of articles, probably in the next 2 years. So I think that speaks reams for the advantages. Not to put down classical publishing, I still publish in those journals. I still like them. I'm an old hand who likes books in my hand, you know. But I think for the newer generation, the digital world is a more comfortable, more dynamic.
Well, now I noted that when you were speaking a while ago, you were talking about, when you were introducing your journal, you were talking about impact factors, and now you're talking about different metrics and the hits that are coming into the journals, which are certainly things that, Carolyn, I'm guessing the early days of Ed Researcher, they had no idea how many people actually read.
No, of course.
Those.
It got pushed out in the mail to every member, but did anyone actually pull the plastic off? Yeah.
So what's going on for all of you, juggling between, impact factor, which I know we consider to be coin of the realm here for the promotion and tenure process, reporting those kinds of things, versus the other kinds of metrics that are accessible to us now, that are visible to us now that everything is digital?
Well, I think you've got a continuum of the advantages of access through digital, and then the determination of quality, and that's so critical for promotion and tenure decisions. So of course the issue is how, what is a good measure of quality? How does that become something that's useful for promotion and tenure decisions? But most of all, how is that useful for the dissemination of knowledge? I mean, I don't think we've cracked that nut. I do think there may be a nice balance between the filtering that happens ahead of time through the blind review process, and then the numbers of clicks, so it's when you can have both of those, you might have a much better measure of quality, and perhaps even more importantly, you have two different measures of quality, and they can stand alone. and argue for themselves. I'm kind of glad that we don't have those aren't merged together. I think it's important for those to stand alone. Exactly what you're describing, the information that virtually anyone has can now be shared with the world, and that's also a great thing. The question is, how do you guide readers in terms of quality? And I think the blind peer review process, with all of its faults, still has a lot going for it, and we haven't yet come up with something that's better than that. I'm certainly open to that, and I still see a lot of disadvantages in it, but it's the best one that I'm aware of.
I'm going to say something slightly provocative, maybe. I'm on the edge of my own seat about this one. So I think that there's an interesting dichotomy between the use of the word quality and the use of the word impact, because I don't know that they're necessarily the same things. And so what the impact factor was intended to do was to give people a sense of whether or not they could trust the research and whether or not it was reputable. I don't know that it ever really did that. I mean, all it's really doing is saying that people cited it, and citing something doesn't mean that you actually said you liked it when you cited it. You might have been citing it as the worst example of that scholarship that ever existed. And that's not something that seems to be well understood when people are looking at bibliometrics. Then when you get into alt metrics or social metrics, what you might be looking at more is whether or not anyone noticed it in a different way than what they were noticing when they were citing something. And it's equally as exciting of a way to measure something. It's fantastic for scholarship that is more cutting edge sometimes, that doesn't necessarily get cited quickly. And so the ability to look to see across media how other things are picking up a scholarly article that might not get picked up anytime soon by academia is, I think, really powerful. But it also doesn't necessarily mean that people liked that resource. It could be that somebody has just got their own host of followers that are doing loads of tweets for them. It's certainly what happens in the fiction world, and they do a lot of work in the fiction world to make sure that that social aspect carries the weight of the world. So I, on behalf of a publisher, will say we really want to make sure that what we're publishing is both quality and also impactful. Whether that impact is that we sometimes are publishing something that is not necessarily new scholarship, but sometimes it's that, yes, that same study could be replicated, and that might not be newsworthy, but it's important to be able to say that something was replicated twice or 3 times. And maybe that actually does mean that something was right about what the first article said. So I'm completely on the fence about the whole idea of quality and impact as something that's measurable.
No, I'm glad you added as something that was measurable. I thought you were going to say you were on the fence about the whole idea of quality and impact.
No,
I think we're all on the same page there. It's just how do you measure it? And of course, good measurement is also a function of what is the intention of the measurement. What is the measurement to be used for? There's multiplicity of ways to use measure. There should be multiple measures because they have multiple uses.
And I think deciding who you want to impact is important. I mean, I know that for this is like a catch-22, because for education and tenure, we want other scholars to be reading our work, but in the field of art education, arts administration, museum education, we want the people in the field to be reading our work too, right? So those aren't the people that are writing about our work, those are the people that are reading it and then doing some of the things that we're trying in our research. So I think for, at least speaking from art education and my kind of small field, which admittedly is very qualitative, like almost more qualitative than qualitative people want to be sometimes. We're in arts-based inquiry and really alternative ways of thinking about what it means to be a researcher, but I think getting your research outside of FSU is very exciting. To have other teachers, people that are where I used to be teaching high school. Having those people read my work is just as important as having a researcher at another university cite me. So I think that Google does some really cool things with showing you who's, are they looking at your work? Because now with Google Scholar, if it's really open access, anybody can read it, right? So I think there's some exciting things happening with, and considering who's reading your work and what's important to you as a researcher too.
The Frontiers obviously has the same concerns regarding quality versus impact factor. There are a number of ways that people discuss this. As I mentioned, the interactive review and discussion of the manuscripts we think helps to promote quality. Once the journal accepts a paper and publishes it online, then the reviewers are named. So now we know, oh, those were good reviewers. Yeah, those are people who you respect. They reviewed the paper and liked it. So kind of gives them a little bit of a seal of approval, you might say. So that gives a little feedback, I think, on the paper itself. Also, the open access field, I think, is interested in the ratio of views to downloads. I've read that 3 to 1 is sort of the goal. For every 3 viewed, that 1 is downloaded. Frontiers is close to that. They're at 3.8 to 1. So I think that speaks also for a certain quality. If a journal is read but not downloaded, people assume that means that article wasn't very relevant or very interesting or very good. If it's downloaded, presumably people want to keep it for further study. There are a lot of demographic information. Because it's a digital world, we can provide the authors, which I think also assists them in understanding what they're publishing, who's reading, who's being impacted by their work. So when the authors receive word of their publication, they're also maintained in a conversation as to how their paper is doing. So monthly they get reports. Your paper has now been cited 25 times in all of these countries. So it gives them a sense for where this is going, how it is impacting the field, and I think that's very useful as well.
Now, all of you are dependent, of course, on the authors to be submitting manuscripts and the reviewers to be providing feedback. But as editors and publishers, you also have a very big role in shaping the research conversation in your field. And you're making decisions about things like aims and scope, special issues, et cetera. And I was hoping that you could all talk a little bit about what you do in that area of shaping the research conversation, especially when you have things like emerging or new topics, new methods that are coming to light.
I'll speak first to that since I'm in the middle of exactly doing something like this.
Excellent.
As Chief Specialty Editor for Frontiers in Endocrinology Systems and Translational Endocrinology, one of my mandates is to follow the developing fields and identify new areas that we can put some focus on. So I am currently developing one of what's known in the Frontiers world as research topics. And this will be a topic that's not been addressed in any serious way before because it's very frontier science, no pun intended. And so the goal is for me as the editor to identify, I actually contacted people who are working, whose publications show that they're working in this really new area, and try and get them together to publish a special research topic. I've done this before. It's difficult. People are busy. You ask them to write something, they say, oh, how many years do I have to do it? Well, you don't have years. We'll do it by 6 weeks from now or 10 weeks or whatever. And so getting enough of them on board is often a challenge. But if it is a new field, they do have some self-interest in promoting their position as frontiers, right, as pioneers. And so many of them will come through. If we get 10 of those researchers submitting an article, then we turn that into what's called an ebook. We actually provide hard copy, print it out as a book and send it in the mail to them. So it's another way of promoting new ideas in the science world. And it's worked very well. It's quite well liked.
And I think all these journals, because of their mission and scope, have different challenges. But and there is a lot of interest because educational research is received by almost all university faculty in the area of education. People would want to see their stuff published because it means their work will presumably have broader impact, at least have a broader readership. So we have a lot of, on terms of kind of the supply side or the demand side, we have people that want to have special issues. We're constantly getting proposals for special issues. We have a strong resistance to that. In other words, the argument for why a special issue, why one of our 9 issues per year should be dedicated to one topic. That's a high bar, and the argument has to be very strong before we will accept that. And we see the trade-off as field-initiated research. Should we allow the field, kind of the marketplace, to ideas coming in from the field? Should they be the ones who take up all? Now we have a limited number of print pages, or are the arguments in favor of a concentration of expertise in a new or an important topic? How do you weigh those two? And we, for the most part, we come down on field-initiated. That we want to remain responsive to what's happening in the field, and we don't want to presuppose our own assessment of what's important. However, we do that. Once a year, we do print a special issue focused on a topic. So there's that. Now, the other issue is coverage. Because we are the premier journal in terms of educational research, just the fact that perhaps a new methodology, a new area of expertise is not represented in the journal, nothing ends up getting published, that in itself says something to the field. And we have to be really careful about that. We don't want to inadvertently say this area is not important, or this new emerging area is not important. So we try to balance the topics that we cover over the course of a year, that they reflect, I won't say accurately, because it really is it's a judgment call, but that we are responsive to new and emerging issues, as well as to areas in which there's already a substantial amount of scholarship, and this is just, and most of what we publish is in areas in which there's already is a substantial amount of scholarship, and this is a new important article that's being added to that knowledge base. The other thing, I don't know if we want to talk about that, is the whole issue of replication, which I think is a huge challenge for the academic publishing world. Because of the emphasis on innovation and originality and what they have, it's a huge issue in education. I think it impacts some of the other fields have handled it better. In education, we did not have a hold on how do we value replication studies.
And I believe Educational Researcher had an article sometime in the last few years that was a call for more replication studies.
You did not replicate that replication study. That would be original.
But I do assign that article to my graduate students, which does not improve your impact factor any, yet it probably does improve some of the alt metrics on it.
Can I just add one more thing on this discussion, which is that, and you've alluded to it, one of the things you can do much more easily than you could do in the print world is take a look across the topics that were submitted to a journal to see where is it that you've turned articles away, not because they weren't looking like they were good articles, but they weren't within the scope of your within your journal. And sometimes that helps us decide that we really should be publishing a whole new journal. Sometimes it helps us decide that it could be a good special topic or a special issue. The other thing that it's interesting when you start to think about what you can do digitally that you couldn't do in print and what that means for how you think about the scope of a journal is, for a lot of journals, they've existed for a really, really long time, and the discipline has changed fundamentally. Sometimes you'll see it represented really quickly in title changes for a journal, which if there are librarians in the room, they're the things that drive Serial's librarians absolutely batty. But it also can be something that you address in the scope of the journal, and you should be addressing within the scope of the journal. And so the title of a journal might change, it might not change. The scope of a journal can absolutely change as the discipline changes. And I know that we've had those conversations with many of our editors as we've seen fields change, and we've then changed both the title and the scope because it wasn't fitting the discipline anymore.
I think that's a challenge. I'm in a journal that's in the midst of revising the scope, and because we're the internet and higher education. And by the way, Carolyn, we get manuscripts that are about neither the internet nor higher education. I'm really not sure how that happens, but it does. And one of the things that we've noted as our journal was started in 1998, very different lay of the land at that time. One of the things that we have noted is we're increasingly getting articles that are about ebooks. Is that really the internet? The first few articles that came out on ebooks got published because, hey, it was cool, it was new, it was emerging, and that's where we were at. Or a lot of things that are about mobile, but not really about internet use. And so we're having to define that. But even as we start to send some authors away from it, saying, go to a journal about mobile learning, they come back and say, but it doesn't say you won't take this in your aims and scope. And it's really important, I think, to keep those up to date and really reflective of what's going on in the field. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, thanks. Before we open this up to questions, just one last thing I wanted to ask you all about was if you wanted to comment on what you see as emerging trends in publishing your journal, things that you think are in the midst of changing right now, or that some changes you think or hope that we might be seeing in the upcoming years.
Well, I think the internationalization of academic publishing is huge. I don't think we don't have a grasp on that at all. It's kind of the wild, wild west now. You have a very differentiated set of countries, no matter what you want to call it, the West versus everybody else, want to call it the North or South, developed and lesser developed countries. Even within these broad categories, there's enormous differentiation at the country level and at the even the regional level within large countries. Some governments across the world are putting enormous pressure on the university faculty to publish in highly ranked journals. Almost all of the highly ranked journals are Western journals, a lot of them American or English language journals. And I fear the distorting impact that researchers who, maybe because they married somebody who speaks English, can publish more easily in English, and yet there are other people doing very important research. It's not as quickly getting published, and it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to worry about. I really have no answers whatsoever to that, but I'm particularly struck as being on the receiving end of these articles that come in from around the world. Obviously, it's so easy to submit an article. If you have the internet, if you have access to the internet, you can submit an article to ER, the educational researcher. But that, in fact, we're not getting them from 200 odd countries. We're getting them from the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and then another handful of countries, Turkey, Spain, Iran, and I've never gotten one. There's so many, probably 100 countries I've never once gotten one submission from, and I don't know the answer to that. I know some of that is driven by federal level governmental policies that require university professors to publish in high impact. China was an example of that, high impact journals. But like I said, I think it's Wild West right now. I think a lot of really good research is being lost. Maybe some research that's not as good, but just the channel to some of the right-wing journals is a little bit easier. And so that research is being prioritized, privileged a little bit. So I think that's a huge challenge. I fear that we're losing important knowledge.
As we move into the terabyte world, I'm particularly impressed by streaming video opportunities. I think we're going to see more and more of that in journals. We're already seeing a few journals that are playing with the idea of having short videos that you actually put online that you can download and watch to learn certain experimental techniques and so forth. I think that's going to make a major impact in the next 10 years.
I think we're going to see, at least in my field, I see a resurgence of the idea of this crisis of representation that happened in the 60s with research is now happening with how we represent digitally, how do we present our findings of our studies. And I think the internet is growing much faster than journals are growing. The internet's growing faster than academies are growing, universities are growing. I think ideas are changing so quickly that I think we're going to see issues with things like issues and what an article is no longer going to be an article. I think that those are the really exciting things that are shifting, and I see it happening in very small journals like JACL because we have very small numbers of submissions, so it's easy to start playing with exciting ways to represent research, and so it'll be really exciting when it starts moving into larger journals that impact many more people. So.
Yeah, I'm going with non-textual, which includes video as one of the biggest trends that online journals can bring. And yes, absolutely streaming video journals, as well as streaming video within a journal article, podcasts that are possible for authors to do to try to sort of translate into easier language what their journal article says. Data and the ability to have data sets be part of the article itself so that somebody can publish the data set that is what they used to write the article. The ability then to figure out whether or not anyone else can get that same result, as well as what else can you do with that data set if that data set was part of the article, is huge.
Great. So I think we have a lot of things to look forward to as we continue on. I'm going to be very interested this afternoon's session that's talking about the promotion and tenure process, because I think that's the other side of this coin of what's going to be considered for to be acceptable for people to do. And I know that it's often a lot of the junior scholars who are willing to take a risk, but a little bit scared of taking a risk and trying something new. So at this point, we've got around 15 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to questions from all of you for our panelists. Do we need to move the microphone around or just use our teacher voices?
I'm Vanessa. I'm Carolyn. I'm the manuscript clearance advisor in the graduate school. So I have a question as editors, not as professors. And as things are so easily accessible online and everything else, dealing with dissertations and theses, what is your perspective as editors when you do see articles that were dissertations and theses placed in something like digital? What is your policy across all of your journals for things like that?
We usually in the author's note, it'll say that the ideas are, I mean, that's what I've encountered, not in our journal, because we've not had any, I haven't run into that yet, but I know the things that I've read, I see people writing about their dissertations, and they are pretty upfront about it in an author's note somehow.
Okay. That hasn't come up. I'm not sure I understand.
Well, as far as when we look at things like our embargo policies and this traditional idea that it can't be accessible in digital prior to them submitting it to journals and stuff, is that even something that you guys look at?
No.
That's excellent history. Thank you.
It normally doesn't appear the same way, right? Like you can't have what was a dissertation be a journal article without a lot of transformation. And it is that transformation that I think makes it possible.
Okay, that's the argument we get all the time, is that you guys won't publish it if we put it in digital.
No, I think that they wouldn't, the two pieces don't look anything the same in the end.
Well, exactly.
We wouldn't publish their entire dissertation in our journal.
Right.
But we would publish their research from their dissertation in our journal.
And often a dissertation gets carved up into multiple journal articles, and it has added nuance on it because, after you write your dissertation, you're like, I hate this thing, I never want to see it again. And then you come back 6 months later and you've presented it at a conference and you have renewed energy for it and you change things, absolutely.
That being said, if you use something like Safe Design, you might find a meaningful overlap. And so then I'm wondering, is there a threshold, a different threshold for people who are converting dissertation work from, say, other published? Is there a different threshold?
I think it's about setting, if you're talking about like the plagiarism software and what
Right,
it's catching, it's about making sure that you've set up that software to know what it's checking against.
Okay.
And so you would say, because a dissertation is it's published, right? You're not wanting to say that it's not published, it's that you're wanting to say it's published in a way that is different than this work.
Right, and arguably carries a very different clout.
That's right.
When PNT, right.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go over here and then we'll come back here and over there and then I'll come over to this side of the room. Okay.
Okay, good morning. I am Yancili Lozano. I am a third-year PhD student from Urban and Regional Planning. And I would like to know, based on your experience, what is that, let's say, most important recommendation that you can give us to publish that article that will have the 300 citations or something like that?
Well, I hate to hear young scholars even talk that way. The Academy certainly has a set of processes for promotion and tenure, and one needs to be familiar with those. But those are all proxies for quality, and they're just ways of managing the system. It's really important to keep the eye on the ball, particularly important for young people to keep the eye on the ball, that this is research that can improve the world, that can make the world a better place. And then it's up to the university promotion and tenure system to adopt their system to honor that. And of course, no one wants to be the sacrificial lamb before that happens, so I totally get that. But in terms of kind of pragmatic advice, is know the journal. That's so many articles I receive are eminently publishable in some other journal, but just not publishable in this journal. And I often feel like the person hasn't taken the hour to, and not just read the mission statement, because I think mission statements of journals can be pretty bland, but just flip through table of contents. Flip through table of contents, get a sense of the scope of the journal, and then read a few articles, get a sense of the language, the taste, the assumed readership that the article is clearly addressing itself to. Is that?
I would agree with that. I think it's important to have good feedback on your work before you submit it. In other words, try and go to the experts in the field, even if you don't know them. Try and get feedback from them. Many of them will be willing to share ideas, try this, change that, but also to know what journal you're going to submit to. That's very important. And I think a little self-promotion helps to get recognition. In other words, go to conferences. Present your work at top-notch conferences. Work that's presented there, if it catches people's eyes, they're going to want to read the whole paper or chapter or whatever, and they're going to go back and look for it, or you can even provide it to them. I think that sort of...
Plus you get great feedback.
Exactly. So I think the whole process has to be a very interactive one with people in the field who are, you might say, the experts.
I'll say with tenure breathing down my neck, like daily, it's right there, all day. I would always read articles, read the journal, and decide where I'm going to submit it before I even start writing. So that, because journals have a style, right? You can feel when you read something from Ed Researcher that it feels like it's from Ed Researcher. So to read the journal before you write don't write an article and then fit it somewhere. So know where you're going to submit something when you write it. Because if I was going to write something for Ed Researcher, it would look much different than if I was going to write it for visual arts research. Those are completely different kind of, they have a different focus. So to be really familiar with where you're submitting before you even start outlining a paper. You might have an interest of what you want to publish on. find a journal that's interested in that, and then look at how people are writing for that journal. Because the people that are being published are the people that are successful. So if you want to be successful too, use those people as exemplars, right? Don't just think that because you're doing it the way you want to do it, that's the way everyone should do it. So I think to be humble and really look at how other people are writing is important.
This might seem a really odd response given what they've just said, which I completely agree with what each of you has said. But my response, if you're trying to think about how your article will even be found, which is fundamental if you're worrying about how it's going to get cited, you need to make sure that the title of the article says something about the topic of the article and isn't so vague that it could be anything. So make sure that the title of the article is a really excellent title. And then for most journal articles, you're asked to write your own abstract and do the exact same thing for your abstract that you would do for your title, to make sure that that is representative of the points that people should be finding in that article, in language that people actually should search by.
I'm just going to add to that quickly. One of the things I tell my doctoral students when they're trying to figure out where to submit is to take a look at the articles that they have based their own work upon. And so, who are you citing? Where have they published? That's where you want to publish, because that's where that research conversation is taking place. And I realize that things have changed and people aren't going to the library like I did in grad school and thumbing through the entire issue and pulling the journals off the shelf to do that. But we still have, you get into the online system of a journal and you see that they're recommending other articles from that journal or from those collections of journals. And you want to be among those people. And so that's really a good way to pick a journal. And to know that the journal will likely be favorable, not because you're citing their work, but because you're working on the same topic that they've represented in the past. All right, in the back.
Hi, I'm Meredith with the University Press of Florida. And building on the whole thesis question thing, I would just encourage you not to publish the meat of that thesis in a journal article, because that really will kill your chances of ever converting it into a book. Because if the big theme is sitting right there in a journal article, I don't have anything to build around. Institutional repositories, I recommend the 2-year moratorium.
Thank you for adding that. Okay, the question.
To add to that, it really depends on the field. In some fields, dissertations are broken up into articles, but especially in humanities, the dissertation is very important. That's the gold standard. That's potentially be a job. So, moratorium for that.
Absolutely. So we take the one that was over here and come back.
Changing the subject. James, you had mentioned very in the beginning that you were introducing yourself. I was really intrigued when you were talking about the verse with authors, like the community review process, how it was more unique or felt like unique or special to your all's process. Would you mind maybe elaborating a little more on that, or what it might look like? I mean, because it sounded really, if I was an author, it sounded really nice that someone would just send me a response saying, okay, the guys will resubmit, follow these recommendations. Any examples of like dialogue might look like?
Well, it looks a lot like a blog. I mean, so-and-so will say, do I need to show this? And the author will answer, yes, but what about this? And then they'll be just going back and forth as if they're talking in real time.
Can we go to Frontier and see that happening?
I mean, it's obviously dependent on both the author's personality, I guess you'd say, and the reviewers who happen to be reviewing that article. But the goal of the reviewers is to be helpful, not to shoot them down, not to discredit them or whatever. We're trying to facilitate publication of this data, but if it's not quite convincing or credible or clear, we want to help them reach that threshold so we can accept it. And this is an ongoing process. If it runs into a stalemate, then the review editor calls me and says, help, we're stuck, we don't know where to go with this. I'll either take it on myself and try to evaluate what's going on, or ask another review editor, a third or even a fourth, to get involved and try and really democratize the whole process. So it is a very dynamic and often time-consuming enterprise, but we think it does provide quality for the work that's published.
And there's really no substitute for something like that. What's happening is that the research society is norming itself. That's what's being circulated. Here are norms of quality. Here are alternative norms of quality. And over time, as more discussion occurs, I think this is a much more dynamic and in some ways, that's a much faster process. But the same thing happens with a legacy journal like mine. Even though you have these static reviews that get emailed to the author, but it's still the same process. And as a junior member coming into a field, you cannot have enough of these conversations because a lot of the norms of quality are not explicitly stated. For one thing, because they themselves are constantly in transition, but you have to be part of that conversation.
Okay, we're going to grab one last question. Oh, it was answered? Okay, perfect. Because I know our time is up now, so I know there's still some hands, which I think means that the session went pretty well. There's still some questions, but hopefully we can have some informal discussion and keep things going during the break. So please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for moderating and for all of you for participating. I think the information that they shared will help all of us become better practitioners in the field, and thank you again.